Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. On a cold November morning, when the fog pressed like damp felt against the glass of Baker Street, I discovered Holmes in a state of remarkable indolence. His violin lay idle on the chair. His chemical table had the abandoned aspect of a battle camp, and he sat with his long limbs coiled against the hearthrug, his eyes half closed, as if the gloomy fire had summoned a ceasefire. London, that great trunk whose lid is rarely completely shut, had drawn itself close for warmth. The street sounds had become muffled, hooves dull on the sodden roads, a distant coster's call muted by the mist, and now and then the faint hiss of raindrops striking the embers. "You've been with the troops again this week," Holmes said without turning his head. My boots deceived me. I laughed, since his voice sounded like a man saying something mundane. "Not your boots, despite being polished by a hand that has recently washed linen in cold water," argues a frugal servant and a cracked basin. "No, your left cuff, which shows a faint stain of carbolic and oil, the same mixture used by the young surgeon at the Marylebone dispensary whose hand you commended last Tuesday. Add to it the slight soreness in your shoulder from holding a ledger on your knee in a jolting cab, and the situation is scarcely a mystery." Before I could respond, our landlady's footsteps rushed up the hallway, and Mrs. Hudson brought in a gentleman whose very presence changed the warmth of the room. He was of medium height, spare and keen-featured, with the acute pallor that often comes with sleeplessness. His coat was excellent and his linen was impeccable. However, his hat, Holmes's gaze was drawn to it as a sign of game, was beaded with fine moisture and dusted with the faintest grey bloom, not of rain, but of ash. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, bowing with a firmness that did not hide the quiver in his hands. "I beg your pardon for my trespass. My name is Basil Fortescue. I'm the secretary for the Aerarium Club on Pall Mall." Holmes beckoned him to the recliner closest to the fire and looked at him, with that combination of civility and penetration that I've seen in quieter men than our visitor. The Aerarium, one of London's more aristocratic haunts, is a sober, pricey place where diplomacy and tobacco have long struck a deal. It takes pride in its library, cellar, and most importantly, smoking room. "You came from a room where several guys smoked," said Holmes. "But you don't," Fortescue commenced. "I have not smoked these 5 years, Mr. Holmes. No. Your breath announces you abstemious. Your coat lacks the stale sweetness that clings to the chronic smoker. And yet your hair—" Holmes moved closer, flicked a stray particle off the man's shoulder, and kept it on the pad of his finger, as the fine deposit of Turkish tobacco, not the club's ordinary Havana fog. "You've been breathing in a heavier atmosphere than Pall Mall typically provides at this hour." Fortescue continued. "It is that very atmosphere that has brought me here," and produced an envelope from his breast pocket, the flap unsealed and the lower edge burnt to brown lacework. "I'm not sure how to present the situation to you without coming across as absurd. We had a death at the club, a truly unfortunate occurrence, as well as an appearance that I can only describe as, for lack of a better term, a writing in smoke." Holmes's eyes opened fully. "Pray be exact in every detail," he muttered. The secretary gulped and proceeded, with the quiet diction of a man versed in committees and minutes. "Last evening, the Right Honourable Lord Welland Fortescue paused. Welland, as you know, has recently served as Under-Secretary at the Home Office, but he retired this summer. He has been a long-time member of our club. He ate modestly, read the evening papers in the library, and at 9:45 begged that the smoking room be left to him for half an hour. He claimed he had letters to write and loathed interruptions. It is not unusual for members to want seclusion. The room was accordingly cleared. Our porter secured the door from the outside with the spring catch, leaving the key on its ring on the corridor hook, as is customary. No one entered at the intermission. The porter entered the door at 10:30, as required by the rules, to indicate that the fires were to be banked and the lights dimmed. Lord Welland was discovered seated in the large leather chair beside the hearth. He did not move. He was deceased, natural causes. I took a chance. That is what Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard believes, Fortescue stated. There were no signs of violence. His lordship's face was somewhat congested, the eyes slightly prominent. The room, however, Fortescue's composure wavered. Mr. Holmes, the room was thick with smoke, thicker than any I had ever seen. And on the oak panel above the mantelpiece there was, how could I put it, a statement, as if written by an invisible hand that the smoke had revealed. We wiped the panel. The letters vanished. When the room became cloudy again, they reappeared. The words were the following: return the letter. Holmes clasped his fingers together and regarded our visitor as a naturalist regards a rare moth. You are certain, sir, that no corrosive or lampblack was applied to the wood? He inquired. We checked it using Lestrade. There was nothing visible on the surface. The words appeared only when the air was dense. When the porter opened the windows, the lettering disappeared like a breath on glass. And has Lord Welland been writing? Fortescue replied, there was stationery on the small table near him, but no written sheets. I just brought a blotter, a crossed pen, and a slightly burnt envelope. He offered it again. Holmes took it, smelled carefully at the burnt edge, and rotated it in his fingers. He mumbled, air curious perfume, rose attar adulterated with benzoin, and a trace of something less innocent. Pray on. There is little else to say. Nobody had observed Lord Welland receive or send a letter that evening. He arrived at 8, left the library at 9:45 and died. Fortescue's voice dropped within that half hour. Lestrade claims that apoplexy or something similar paralyzed him in the chair. He speculates that a servant may have played a foolish trick on the panel with lampblack or walnut juice at some point in the past. The message is either impertinence or coincidence, and you do not think that is sufficient. Fortescue's fists curled around the cap on his lap. Mr. Holmes, the aerarium does not quake at coincidence. But there's this. Yesterday morning the porter delivered me an envelope addressed only to the secretary. It had a single ripped scrap with the inscription, when the smoke rises, so shall the truth. I took that as a courtesy and destroyed it. Now his gaze shifted from Holmes to me and back again. I'm afraid I destroyed a warning. Holmes rose with the startling alacrity that usually signaled action. Your porter, an elderly soldier who is short of breath, has a cough that he denies and enjoys shagging, is a careless fellow in small issues and a martinet in large. I dare believe his keys are hung like medals, and he looks at them more often than necessary. He will declare the door was secure because he prides himself upon it. Very good. We're going to put his pride to the test. Watson, your coat. Will you come at once? Fortescue's relief was so strong that it crossed into anxiety. The club committee is already concerned. Lord Welland's name is not one we would have printed in combination with silly spectacles. I confess I came to you before expressing to his family the peculiarity of the panel. Holmes retrieved his hat and cane. He remarked, you did well. On some occasions silence is the only weapon that innocence has. Tell me, Mr. Fortescue, Lord Welland did not smoke Turkish cigarettes? Never. He was a Havana man until the end. He had a particular love for the Rio Seco brand. And yet, sir, your hair has just tasted the breath of a very fine Turkish leaf, the kind that is popular in some international cafes and among a limited class of Londoners who have an influence in the Levant. Holmes's eyes had a remote brightness, which was more like acceleration than light. One more thing. Who aside Lord Welland knew he'd have the chamber to himself? No one, to my knowledge. The request was made discreetly to me, and I handed the order to the porter, so the room was not empty before his lordship entered. For about 2 minutes, while the few remaining members drifted off, Mr. Chaffin, a barrister, Colonel Mowat and Mr. Dacres from the bank were the last to go. They can all be accounted for after 10. Holmes nodded, as if putting pegs in a mental hat stand. Return the letter, he repeated softly, as if addressing the oak panel directly. Some letters are returned to the sender out of courtesy, others out of fear, and a few because keeping them would lead to ruin. Come, Watson, Mr. Fortescue, we will worry your porter first, your panel second, and your cellar last, though I am curious about your Turkish supply. 5 minutes later, we were in a hansom, our city's nimble insect, jolting toward Pall Mall in a fog that appeared to have been deliberately created. Holmes sat with his head bowed and his long fingers tapping a silent pace against his knee. I knew better than to interrupt his daydream. He was erecting timber by timber one of those airy structures of thinking that I had seen withstand the most severe battering of facts. He only spoke once, and it wasn't to me. There are guys, Watson, who write with ink and leave blotches, and there are men who, to save their skins, write with air and hope the world does not learn to read it. This morning our task is to read smoke. If the reader believes that the events that followed were anything but remarkable, he underestimates both the cleverness of wickedness and the strange principles that govern its revelation. For in that sober smoking room, with its leather chairs and courteous lamps, we would come across an invisible contrivance and a message that demanded to be seen only when the lungs protested. And though I didn't realize it at the time, there was a letter underlying it all, that if kept would have unmade a guy who thought he was beyond the law. We discovered the aerarium with its newly rubbed brass and the porter precisely as Holmes had predicted. Short, square and studded with keys as if he paraded campaign medals. He saluted Fortescue with aggrieved precision before leading us down a hushed corridor smelling of old leather and damp wool. Holmes allowed his sight to loiter over trifles, the cut of the porter's heels, a rip on the bell pull, a smear of soot above the transom, while Fortescue repeated in a quieter tone the club's wretched chronology. "Before we proceed," Holmes told us, "I should like to see the hook on which your keys hang." The man rattled them attentively and pointed to a glossy board near the door. Holmes stooped like a fisherman inspecting an unusual plant. A single ring was scored, where a key had been replaced with a quicker hand than pride would confess, because the varnish around it was gently abraded, while its neighbors gleamed like bishops. Holmes' cane tip made contact with the faint dust line below the hook. "You were punctual then," he mumbled. "More punctual after the discovery than before?" The porter colored. I had the door open in a trice when it was time, sir." "Ah," Holmes responded, dismissing the situation with a nod that implied he hadn't discounted it at all. When we entered the smoking area, it was that decent refuge, where a man can envision himself thinking better with a cigar. The chairs sat quietly together, Turkish rugs absorbed light, and the large oak panel above the mantel viewed us with seasoned prudence. The fire had been relit. Outside, the fog forced its blank face against the windows. Lestrade awaited us, a tiny figure with a professional, although slightly sulky countenance, like a terrier forced to sit. "You are late to a plain business, Mr. Holmes," he told me. "A gentleman takes ill and dies. The rest is fable." Holmes's bow was as thin as a pulled violin string, and the fable writes itself on oak. "Will you oblige me by getting those windows shut?" "No, quite closed, please. Watson, help with the curtains." "Thank you." "And you, Fortescue, will not allow anyone to enter until I say so." Lestrade sniffed. "You'll choke us for a fancy." "I'll teach the air to speak," Holmes replied, kneeling at the hearth. He checked the grate, the shovel, the coal scuttle, and gingerly took a spent match from the fender with a folded handkerchief, the wood of which was stained a strange amber halfway to the head. He raised it up to his nose. "There is no doubt that benzene exists. Resin especially liked by individuals who desire their smoke to carry secrets. Benzoin?" I asked. "A gum that when heated emits a delicious odor and forms a layer to which soot will readily adhere. Combine that with a fine, dry Turkish tobacco, and your vapor will write like a pen on any surface ready to accept it." The mail we saw had been signed by the same agency. Some consider it a foolish toy, while others see it as a language. He took a small spirit lamp from his pocket, a familiar companion of his more mysterious experiments, and lit it within the grate, where the air would draw steadily. He took a paper twist from another pocket, unrolled it, and revealed a pinch of brown flakes. "A sample I have carried since a case in Fitzroy Square," he apologized to Fortescue's widened eyes. He crumbled the leaf into the lamp's blue tongue and lowered the small iron grate. A thin, perfumed smoke curled upward as gently as a kitten. We waited while the room went dim inside itself, the air taking on a glossy solidity. Lestrade coughed loudly twice, each time with less bravado. Holmes had positioned himself beneath the panel, his gaze intense. It was I who first noticed the letter forms detach themselves from the grain, like dew outlines a spider's web, faint at first, then darkening gradually until the words stood boldly on the wood. "Return the letter," the inspector uttered an oath. Fortescue's breath caught, and his gloved fingers whitened on the back of a chair. Holmes did not exclaim. He approached the panel, held his lens a mere inch away, and traced the margin where the letters faded into wood with the ferrule of his cane. Then, using the nail of his fingers, he scraped softly, bringing back a dust finer than flour. He held it out for me. "Do you observe, Watson? Not only soot, there's a sticky granularity like powdered rosin." "Prepared," I said. "Someone painted the words with a solution, and the smoke has found purchase." "Exactly so. The message then is no miracle but a contrivance. The question becomes, whose deception and when?" He cast a glance at the fire-iron stand. "A smear on the poker where it was warmed to hasten the drying, and this," he pointed to a barely visible drip at the curve of an O, "tells us the hand was not practiced." The letters swell and narrow. Notice how the second R falters. An amateur with instructions or a guy of talent hurrying? Lestrade recovered his voice. "What if it's a trick? What about death? I have apoplexy, according to my doctor. Your physician notes a face suffused, eyes prominent. He did not note." Holmes pointed to the wing-back chair in which we were told Lord Welland had sat, the tickle of ash inside the collar where it touches the nape. "He didn't notice the small blister on the inner rim of the cigar cutter. Mr. Fortescue, let me see the cutter. It was brought from a drawer in the sideboard." Holmes kept it level and blew sharply. A flake plucked off the interior face of the ring, a crystal virtually imperceptible. He touched it with his mouth and immediately spat into the grate. Bitter almond, the ghost of it. It is just how I had dreaded. The crystals form when prussic acid vapor condenses on a cold metal. There isn't enough left to kill a flea right now, but there was plenty last night if applied to the lips quickly and confidently. Lestrade starred. "You accuse a cutter?" "I blame a human hand of preparing it, knowing his lordship's preference for a clean ending to his Havana. Our man paints the panel to create an after-dinner melodrama and plants the means beside the chair." Lord Welland trims his cigar and draws the object near. A film of poison, which evaporates quickly when warmed, slips over the cut tobacco and the lips that test the drawer. Lestrade has a quick hand. A private half-hour. A window that opens too late. Holmes placed down the cutter as gently as if it were a snake. Fortescue had sunk into a chair. Good God! Then it was murder. "Not yet in the press," Holmes observed dryly, "and thus still ours to interpret." "Who knew about the half-hour?" "You, the porter, and the 3 others who left the room as he entered." "Which of the 3 smelled like the Levant?" Fortescue appeared terribly uncertain. "Chaffin smokes pipes of the common sort. The Colonel abhors cigarettes. Mr. Dacre's, I cannot recall." Holmes had already moved, his attention returning to the transom. He sat in a chair and ran his finger along the ledge above the door, before lowering the hinge. "Our porter is a martinet in major issues," he remarked softly, "and a sloven in the minor. He takes satisfaction in closing a door, but neglects to dust what is not visible. Take note of the narrow streak where dust has lately been broken, by a string drawn smartly over the angle. A cord connected maybe to a key ring lifted for a second from its hook." The porter bristled. "No one touches my keys." "Except for a man who stood talking to you and on some joke or pretext." "What was it?" "Asked to see the actual hook. You turned to show off your punctuality and method, and his hand did the rest. The key was out and returned in a heartbeat, just enough to leave an impression in wax and slip the door later when Lord Welland was alone." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "And where did your magician stand?" Holmes pointed at the hearthrug. "Here. See the faint half-moon of ash where a heel is turned inward, an Eastern habit for anchoring the foot while lighting a small cigarette from a coal. The ash is not from Havana. It is way too fine." He let the smoke clear, ripped open the curtains, and the letters dissolved back into honest oak in the bright sunlight. The room appeared to exhale. "Names, Mr. Fortescue," Holmes said. "Addresses. The last known activities of Mr. Dacres, Mr. Chaffin, and Colonel Mowat. Also included is a list of staff who have access to this chamber and the sideboard that houses the cutter. I'll also need the club's guest register from yesterday and the evening before." Lestrade had retrieved his terrier's set. "And what part of London do you hunt first, Mr. Holmes?" "The part where men who do not smoke pretend they do," Holmes replied. "A very little ring of cafes where Turkish leaf is treasured and benzoin is more than perfume. There I hope to find a gentleman whose hair smelled of the Levant this morning, and who knew last night that a letter, some letter, was held over Lord Welland like a sword." He returned his gaze to the panel, hoping for an answer from the wood. "Return the letter," he said. He couldn't return something he didn't have. As a result, Inspector, We must find out who placed that demand here, knowing it would be read only after a guy had gone mute, and who planned for him to say nothing at all. Holmes exited the club with the rapid step of a guy who had already sketched a map in his head and now wanted merely to stroll its streets. The fog had increased, and the lamps glowed like yellow wicks within woolen lanterns. We hailed a cab, and Holmes directed the driver to Soho with precision that suggested he had already decided on his hunting ground. I knew better than to pester him with questions, for his mood was as taut as wire, yet there was no denying the current of thinking that went through him. His eyes were half closed, his lips hardly moving, and he repeated the words in a rhythm, as if each syllable knocked on a concealed door. I returned the letter. It was around Wardour Street that Holmes dismissed the cab and led me on foot through a network of little alleys where the fog grew perfumed with spices, lamp oil and the subtle sweetness of incense. Finally, we arrived at a cafe whose sign, painted with minarets and moons, was virtually invisible in the dim lighting. Inside, the air was thick with Turkish tobacco, which rose in blue coils, giving the place a surreal look. Ben sat cross-legged on low divans, sipping from long pipes, eyes half-lidded but alert. Conversation was mumbled in non-London accents, and everything was done with the lazy concealment of a place used to listening ears. Holmes did not arrive as a stranger. With a flick of his wrist, he produced a visiting card, handed it to the proprietor, and spoke in a language I did not understand. The man bowed low and gestured to a table in the corner. As we took our seats, Holmes bent near. "Here, Watson, one discovers every scent and vice the Levant has to offer. Benzoin, opium, amber, and most importantly, the Turkish leaf. Examine the clientele. They are not ordinary sailors or laborers, clerks, minor officials, a scattering of students and a few whose coat style suggests a wealthier table. Among them, if chance favors us, our man." He did not have long to wait. A thin man entered, carrying himself with the peculiar stiffness of someone used to controlling nerves through willpower. His moustache was perfectly waxed, his hair was oiled, and he scanned the room with a caution that contrasted with the surroundings. Holmes's eyes brightened up, as if he'd discovered a dropped coin. "There," he muttered. "Mr. Dacres, from the bank. Consider how his hair sparkles with the same grey ash that I saw on Fortescue. He will sit down, start a cigarette, and betray himself." As if on cue, the man took a slim case from his pocket and lit a Turkish cigarette with the practiced inward turn of heel Holmes had demonstrated in the smoking room. He breathed gently, watching the curls fall before his face. Holmes rose and crossed the room with the demeanor of a casual acquaintance. I observed him exchange a few words, bend close and chuckle in that uncommon and disarming style, which appeared to disarm even the wary. Dacres looked surprised, then cautious, then faintly uneasy. Within minutes, Holmes had secured his permission to join him, and they both returned to our corner. "My friend Dr. Watson," Holmes said smoothly, "knows more about apoplexy than I ever will." "We were just talking about a mutual acquaintance, the late Lord Welland." Dacre's hand faltered at the name, and the cigarette burned an inch of wasted smoke before he recalled to draw. He recovered swiftly, perhaps too rapidly, and called it a shock. "I was in the same room about half an hour before his lordship appeared. Even if a guy is strong and elderly, his heart can betray him at any time." Holmes nodded as if accepting the platitude. "Exactly so. But isn't it strange that the panel chose to inscribe itself with a demand for a letter to be returned?" "What marvels London produces," Dacres blinked. "A panel?" Holmes leaned closer, his voice soft and confiding. "Come, Mr. Dacres. You did not stay in that room without seeing what happened there. The panel talked, but only to those who knew how smoke writes. Your hair still echoes its message." For a moment the man appeared to shrink into himself, then tensed. "I know nothing of panels." I exited the room with Colonel Mowat. If there was writing, it was new to me. Holmes eyed him with that expression I have seen put the stoutest criminal speechless, the half-smile, the half-closed eyes, and the patient quiet that pushes a man to fill it. "That last," Dacres murmured. "If there was a message, it was no concern of mine." Holmes's reply was silk over steel. "And yet the letter it mentioned was an affair of yours, wasn't it? You were aware that Welland had been entrusted with files concerning the bank's affairs. You also realized that those documents may ruin a reputation, even a career. Return the letter." "Ah, but it was not in his possession to return, was it?" "It was in your possession." The cigarette trembled between Dacre's fingers. He ground it out with undue vigor before abruptly rising. "Sir, you speak in riddles, and I dislike them. Good evening." Holmes did not move to apprehend him. He watched the man disappear into the fog, with that strange expression of satisfaction that was never the sign of a completed hunt, but of a trail scented anew. Only when the door had closed did he speak. "He's our fox, Watson. He carries shame in his every breath. But the crime is not entirely his." Another hand, cooler and less awkward, prepared the panel and cutter. Dacres may have lit the match, but someone else set the fuse. "Come. We must meet with Colonel Mowat and Mr. Chaffin before the yard stumbles into daylight with an overly simple story." We stepped back into the fog, the lights dimming and the city closing in on us like an unfinished novel. Holmes made a beeline for Mayfair, where the Colonel dwelt, his footfall fast despite the mist. I followed in silence, aware that the puzzle's lines were tightening, and that somewhere between the smoke-written words and the bitter almond trace lay the shadow of a letter worth a man's life. The cab took us westward, the fog clearing as we entered the spacious streets of Mayfair, where lamps glimmered against polished railings and hooves clattered more clearly. Holmes reclined back with his arms folded, his gaze concentrated on some point inward, as if a mathematician saw his problem written in air. Finally he stirred and spoke half to himself. "Dacres flinches like a guilty man, but the hand behind the panel is steadier than his. There is more than one actor present, Watson. A partnership, perhaps, but not of equals. I detect a directing mind." When we arrived at the Colonel's home, a sturdy townhouse with columns in front and subtle lighting within, we were admitted right away. Colonel Mowat was an imposing figure, his shoulders still square despite his age, and his demeanor harsh to the point of curtness. He greeted us in a study filled with campaign maps and guns hung above the mantel, the smell of polish and pipe smoke lingering in the air. "Mr. Holmes," he explained, "you are not the first to call today. That dog from the yard has been following me around since the morning. I tell you the same thing I told him. I smoked my pipe, finished my paper, and departed Welland in peace. Whatever misfortune befell him happened after I left." Holmes politely dropped himself into a chair. "I don't dispute your word, Colonel. However, mischief has a way of sowing itself before the harvest. Tell me, did you notice anything weird in the room before you left?" "Unusual," the Colonel grimaced. "Only Dacres seemed uneasy. He lingered after the rest of us had left, fidgeting with his cigarette case as if he had misplaced something. I reminded him that it was bad form to delay a man who desired privacy. He murmured something I missed and eventually followed. Beyond that, nothing." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly on the chair arm. "And you saw Welland later in the evening?" "I didn't. I went right home. He had already left by the time I heard the news." The Colonel's demeanor relaxed slightly. "I knew him for many years. We served together in India. His death, however it occurred, is a loss." Holmes observed him for a long while, then rose. "You have been quite explicit, Colonel. One more question. Did Lord Welland ever mention to you the matter of private papers, letters perhaps, that disturbed him?" The Colonel's brow knit. "Never to me. He constantly had a closed mouth. If there was such a burden, he carried it alone." We departed, and Holmes remained silent in the cab until the lights of Mayfair faded behind us. A soldier, Watson, honest and unpolished. He is not a trickster. However, take heed of what he said. Dacres was lingering and restless. A man was unsure whether his preparations had been uncovered. The chain tightens. Our next appointment was to Mr. Chaffin, a barrister whose offices were near Lincoln's Inn. We found him in a dim office cluttered with briefcases and smelled of ink. He was a wiry man with a swift, bird-like demeanor, his fingers ink-stained, his gaze flitting between Holmes and myself as if calculating every sentence for cost. When told of our mission, he laughed briefly. "Lord Welland's death is a tragedy, but if you believe I had any involvement or knowledge in it, you are mistaken. I left that room no later than the Colonel." "The club is not a place for drama." Holmes's voice was soft, and yet melodrama intruded. "You saw nothing of the panel, nothing of the cutter upon the sideboard." "Nothing whatsoever. My business was with a case file, and once completed I excused myself. Yes, I left Dacres behind. He didn't appear to want to quit smoking. But I observed nothing amiss." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "You use precise language, sir, as is appropriate for your occupation. Permit me one more inquiry. Did you ever see correspondence between Lord Welland and the bank? Any mention, perhaps, of securities or guarantees? Chaffin stiffened. You raise questions that undermine confidence. As a barrister, I cannot disclose— You have already disclosed, sir, Holmes interrupted, by your defensiveness. I don't require specifics. I simply need information. That Welland's possession of specific letters was known to others besides yourself. That is enough. Chaffin coloured but did not respond. Holmes thanked him formally and led me away. Outside, he summoned a cab once more, his face filled with suppressed energy. We've got 3 witnesses, Watson. One who lingers uncomfortably, observes that lingering and understands more about letters than he cares to confess. Consider this. Who among them was capable of painting a panel with resin or poisoning a cutter? Not the colonel, whose hands are better suited to sabres. Not the barrister, but he may understand the importance of language. The banker, Dacre, moves between accounts and documents, frequents a cafe known for benzoin, and trembles at the mention of letters. And yet he is not alone. Someone directs him. The cab jolted us back toward Baker Street, the fog lifting and daylight looming in the east. Holmes squeezed his fingers together under his chin. Watson, there's an invisible companion here. Someone who wanted Welland silenced and used Dacres as an instrument. We have not seen the letter yet. But its shadow lies everywhere. We must return to the club tomorrow at first light, when Lestrade is tired and less likely to defend his theories. In the meantime, I have a quick errand. He dismissed me at our door, but then strode away into the night with that peculiar tirelessness that came with the scent of prey. When he returned hours later, his coat damp with fog and his eyes shining, he refused to speak at first. Only after he had thrown himself onto the sofa and lit his pipe did he say in a casual tone, "The bank has enemies, Watson. One of them has learned to write in smoke." He wouldn't say anything else, and I was left with the uneasy feeling that the letter in question was more than just a little indiscretion, but a document powerful enough to tip the scales of men's fortunes, and possibly even ministries. Lord Welland had died under its shadow. When Holmes emerged from his chamber the next morning, his expression had that strange light that I had come to recognize as the sign of quick discovery. He had slept little, if at all, but he carried himself with the zeal of a man whose mind had been sharpened by the night. Without further ado, he instructed me to take my hat, and we walked swiftly through the crisp air, the fog of the previous evening having faded to a pale haze. The streets, clean from a little shower, glittered in the feeble sun. Holmes returned to Pall Mall, where the aerarium appeared sombre and respectable, as if the secrets of the night had never been whispered within its oak-panelled walls. Lestrade awaited us at the door with a sour, triumphant expression. "You have arrived too late, Mr. Holmes. I have a man." Dacres was photographed at dawn. He denied much, but the evidence was clear enough. His bank debts, strange haunts in Soho, and unease when questioned all point to the same conclusion. He killed Welland to conceal some fraud, and the case is closed. Holmes regarded him with a gaze so coldly amused that the inspector shifted in irritation. "Ended, you say? A case is not ended when the wrong man is in custody, Lestrade. Dacres is guilty of something, but not of murder by poison. If you will allow me the courtesy of 1 hour in the smoking room, I will prove it to you." Grumbling, Lestrade consented, and we were admitted once more to that sombre chamber. The panel above the mantelpiece stared back at us in honest silence, the fire laid fresh but not yet lit. Holmes knelt at the hearth with a deliberation that spoke of preparation rather than improvisation. From his pocket he drew a small file and a scrap of cloth, moistening the wood along the skirting. A faint odour rose, sweet, resinous, unmistakable even to my untrained senses. "Benzoin again," Holmes murmured. "It clings like a guilty conscience. Observe, Watson, the line of smears just below the letters. It was not Welland who touched this panel, but another hand, tall enough to reach without stretching. Dacres is slight, scarcely taller than yourself. To paint so evenly, the brush must have moved from the shoulder of a man of greater height. Consider also the tremor in the strokes, not the unsteady nerves of Dacre, but the haste of a stronger man ill-suited to delicate work." Lestrade snorted. "And who is this taller phantom, if not the banker?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "The colonel, of course, a soldier accustomed to bold movements, not fine lines. He admitted he left the room after Dacres, yet Chaffin declared the opposite. The inconsistency betrays him. One of them lied, but only one had cause to. Colonel Mowat had history with Welland in India, and that history may conceal a debt of loyalty, or more dangerously, of betrayal. I could not restrain my astonishment. But Holmes the Colonel was frank, almost blunt in his manner. He seemed the least likely of all to practice subterfuge. Exactly, answered Holmes. His most effective defense is his bluntness mask. However, the cutter's preparation, which required access to the sideboard, had to be done while the room was unattended for a short time. Who had both the opportunity and power to loiter there without suspicion? Not Dacres, whose uneasiness was obvious. Not Chaffin, who was eager to leave. However, a colonel who was respected and familiar with the club may linger by the sideboard while others paid no attention. Watson, it was he who planted the poison, even if he delegated the writing to someone else. Fortescue entered at that moment, his face pale from lack of sleep. In his hand he had a sealed envelope. "Mr. Holmes," he explained, "this was found this morning in the club's letterbox. It's addressed to me, but within—" He broke the seal and removed a single page. It included the inscription, "The truth lies buried with Welland. Don't pursue it any further." Holmes inspected the document intently, scented it, and put it up to the light. Written in haste using ordinary ink and folded, while the paper was still damp. It bears no watermark, but the fibers tell me it is from the same stock that the club offers to its members. Our author worried being discovered within these walls, yet he dared not write elsewhere. That narrows the field. He abruptly turned toward Fortescue. "Sir, when you spoke yesterday of the warning you destroyed, the scrap that said 'when the smoke rises,' did you destroy it entire or keep some portion?" Fortescue flushed. I confess I tore it, but one corner remained in my drawer. I thought it was too small to matter." "Bring it to me immediately," Holmes ordered. The secretary obliged and returned with the fragment. Holmes examined the fibers of the two papers, his lens moving along the edges. As I expected. "Same batch. Take note of the hand. See how the descender of the G drags considerably, precisely like in this morning's message. The same author, Watson. The same man who placed the message in smoke upon the panel." Lestrade, however plainly hesitant, leaned forward. "Then who, Mr. Holmes, if not Dacres?" Holmes grinned thinly. "Patience, Inspector. The net can only be closed when all of its knots are tied. For the time being, we must set up a test. When the members reconvene this evening, we will request their presence in the smoking room. I'll ask everyone to write a line for some minor purpose. The hand will reveal itself, as will the murderer. Until then, put your prisoner under close surveillance. He may still betray an accomplice." As we exited the club, I noticed Holmes's pace increase and his eyes light up with the excitement of the hunt. "You see, Watson," he remarked, "a letter once written may be burned, but its shadow remains, clinging to ash, resin, and the guilty fingers that strove to erase it. Welland had such a letter, one that mentioned deeds in India that were long considered to be buried. Mowat feared its return, and Dacres, the poor fool, was brought in as a tool or pawn. But the genuine web is wider, and before the night is up, I will have its master in my hands." I couldn't help but shudder. For the air around us seemed suddenly cold, even though the sun had risen, and I knew that beneath the peaceful surface of London was a secret capable of killing one man, and terrifying others into quiet. And as Holmes walked me back toward Baker Street, I had the impression that the letter hidden in smoke was beginning to write its story on all of us, line by line, until the final revelation stood out as clearly as written on oak. That afternoon was spent in anxious anticipation. Holmes paced the sitting room like a caged hound, halting only to scribble quick notes or study volumes of reference with a controlled restlessness. He had dispatched a boy from the irregulars with orders that I was not supposed to hear, and when the fellow returned near twilight, Holmes pocketed the scrap of paper he had brought without saying anything. Finally, as the street lamps were turned on, he sprang up quickly, shoved his arms inside his greatcoat, and stated that the hour had come. The aerarium greeted us with its normal stillness, but I sensed a worried undercurrent in the movements of its members. Fortescue approached us in the vestibule, his composure frayed. "The committee agreed to your request, Mr. Holmes. The gentlemen have gathered in the smoking room. They are uneasy, but they agreed, though Colonel Mowat growled loudly." "Excellent," Holmes said, his tone clear as the evening air. "Let us not keep them waiting." The scene within was unique. Around the large table sat the three individuals on whom suspicion had been cast: Mowat grim and stubborn, Chaffin cool and vigilant, and Dacres pallid and twitching. Lestrade, stationed by the mantel with two constables discreetly behind him, appeared to prefer another location, but was resolved to see the play through. Holmes advanced to the table with easy authority. "Gentlemen," he added, "this inquiry has been plagued by shadows and whispers. Tonight we will have light. I just ask that each of you write a simple line on this sheet, nothing more than return the letter. A trivial activity, but it will suffice." He placed fresh paper and a pen on the table. The colonel snorted, but grabbed the pen first, scrawling the phrase in big strokes and flinging it down with the air of a man offended by the request. Chaffin followed, his hand quick and exact, the letters as neat as a clerk's. Dacres was last. His hand shook significantly as he wrote, resulting in an uneven line, with ink blotting where he squeezed too hard. Holmes grabbed the slips, placed them next to the previous message, and bent over them with his lens. The clock ticking and the slight crackle of the fire were the only sounds that disturbed the silence. He eventually straightened out, holding one slip between his fingers and thumb. "Here it is," he said softly. The hand which threatened Welland before his death. The T-down stroke and the G-drag are similar. "Gentlemen, the author is Mr. Chaffin." There was a commotion in the room. Chaffin's thin lips tightened, but he held Holmes's gaze steady. "Preposterous," he replied. "A mere resemblance. Anyone could form letters in a similar way." "Not so," Holmes replied. "I have examined thousands of specimens." "Your hand betrays you. Furthermore, because you were involved in bank-related activities, you were the only person who knew the letter's legal weight. You were aware of Welland's possessions and afraid that they might be disclosed. To silence him, you staged this hideous performance using Mowat's presence as cover and Dacres as a tool. You painted the panel, drafted the threats, and positioned the poisoned cutter. The others were pawns. You were the strategist." Chaffin's serenity broke. His fingers trembled at the armrests of his chair, and a sheen of sweat glittered on his forehead. Mowat rose to his feet in outrage. "Are you accusing us all?" "I have no involvement in such devilry." "Indeed," Holmes said calmly. "You had none save that your straightforward honesty disguised the confusion of times that Chaffin demanded. Colonel, you were misled, as was Dacres here. The true mastermind is still sitting before us." Lestrade stepped forward, his gaze narrowing. "Do you deny it, Mr. Chaffin?" The barrister's tone was as cutting as a whip. "I deny nothing. Yes, I penned those words, but I didn't put poison in that cutter. I'm no assassin. I merely wanted to scare Welland, forcing him to return the cursed document before it was too late. Someone else carried my warning further than I had planned." Holmes's gaze hardened. "At last the truth begins to emerge. Then who? Who held the cutter? Who poisoned it? You mentioned too late. Too late for who?" Chaffin's gaze flashed to Dacres. The banker flinched as if struck. "It was not I," he sobbed. "He pressed me to recover the letter. I worried account exposure, dishonor, and bankruptcy. But I never touched the awful instrument. I swear it." Their voices caused the room to quake. Holmes lifted his hand to signal stillness. "Enough. You, Chaffin, wrote the threats. You, Dacres, supplied motivation. But the deed itself, the cool application of poison to steel, was performed by someone with both access and authority, a man who could sit at the sideboard without scrutiny. That's Colonel Mowat." The colonel's expression darkened like thunder. "You dare, I dare because the evidence compels me," Holmes remarked with cold calm. "The smear of resin bore the stroke of a tall arm. The cutter was handled by someone who understood the weight of weapons, and you, Colonel, stood to lose the most if Welland returned that letter. Years ago in India, you engaged in some transactions which Welland documented in a private paper. Its eruption would not only injure you, but destroy you. You silenced him in the only way you knew." A horrible quiet ensued. Mowat's jaw tensed, and I believed he was about to attack Holmes. His shoulders finally dropped, and he sank back into his chair. When he spoke, his voice sounded hoarse. "He'd have ruined me. After all these years of dedication and honor, he would have brought it to light. I couldn't let it happen." Lestrade motioned to his men, who moved forward to secure him. Chaffin covered his face with his hands, and Dacre slumped as if the weight of fear had been lifted, only to be replaced by shame. Holmes stood calmly amidst the chaos, his eyes steely and his demeanor seemingly aloof. "This concludes the play," he said. "A letter, a panel, a poisoned cutter, all part of a plan to safeguard reputations based on sand." Lord Welland refused to return the letter because he no longer had it. You three were aware of this fact, but each was concerned that the others would accuse them. It is a frequent fate for conspirators. Distrust fosters violence which discloses itself. As Lestrade escorted the colonel away, Holmes looked at me with a tiredness that only I could see through his mask. "Come, Watson. There isn't much more for us here. The letter itself may yet be discovered, but its shadow has already claimed one life and destroyed 3 others. I believe it will never disturb the brightness again." We strolled out into the night, the fog stirring again down the pavement. Holmes pulled his coat close and started a cigarette. His words carried through the smoke like a tombstone. "Men think they can burn paper and be free, Watson. However, paper burns slowly when it contains truth. In the end, the smoke tells their tale for them, and the world learns to read it." The cab rattled us back toward Baker Street in complete quiet, its wheels creating sparks on the damp stones where gaslight pooled in wavering rings. Holmes sat hunched in his corner, the glow of his cigarette a solitary ember, his thoughts locked away from my reach. I'd seen him prevail many times before, but tonight he lacked the air of success. When at last he spoke, it was as though his voice had traveled from a tremendous distance. "Justice, Watson, is a flimsy term. Yes, Mowat's hand placed the poison, but not with the dark impulse of a cutthroat. He behaved out of desperation, like a soldier who hated dishonor more than death. Chaffin wrote his threats to coerce, not murder. Decres was a pawn in the shadow of disaster. Nonetheless, Welland remains silent, and the whole truth has yet to be revealed. We've identified the criminals, but not the reason." I reminded him that the colonel's confession was clear enough. The Indian years and the secrets buried there provided plenty motivation. Holmes shook his head. "A confession obtained through collapse is not always true, Watson. It is a surrender." He admitted what was plainest. "But I suspect more. Do you recall the notes? Both the fragment and the morning warning? They were written not only to silence Welland, but also to misdirect. Someone wanted to cast suspicion on one individual, then another, to keep us chasing shadows while the real treasure slipped away. And the prize, I gently stated, is the letter itself." "Precisely. It led to Welland's death. But where is it today? It was not found on him, in the smoking area or among his files. If Mowat murdered to prevent its return, he did not own it. Someone else does, and that someone is still at liberty." His comment struck me with a cold deeper than the fog. Despite the Yard's pride in having secured its prisoner, the case was far from over. The next morning brought a damp greyness over London, the city yawning back to its labours as though no death had soiled the night before. Over breakfast, Holmes opened the Times and read it silently before tossing it down with disdain. They trumpet the arrest as though it were the crown jewel of detection. The world is satisfied with a basic villain, but we are not of this world, Watson. We must go deeper. He spent the morning with frantic energy, dispatching telegrams, reviewing ledgers, and rummaging through the chemical cabinet with whispered computations. By lunchtime, he had put on his coat again. "Come," he instructed. "We must contact Lady Welland. If anyone knows what happened to that letter, it is she." The widow welcomed us into her drawing-room, a tiny figure dressed in black, her face pallid, but her eyes steadfast. Holmes's demeanour toward her was grave and respectful. He began by discussing her husband's habits, his recent concerns, and his correspondence rather than murder. She answered calmly, but her voice quivered at times. "He seemed worried, Mr. Holmes. For weeks I saw it. He spoke little, but at night he would pace or sit long at his desk staring at papers. I once asked him what load he carried. He just said, 'The past will not be buried.' I assumed he was referring to his health, perhaps politics. So I didn't realize it was so serious." Holmes leaned forwards gently. "Did he ever show you a letter, or speak of one that endangered him?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "Just once. He stated that he had gotten a telegram from abroad, India, I believe, reminding him of an occurrence from long ago. He burnt it right away, but then he continued to dig through his papers as if another was missing. He feared that some documents had been stolen from him. He told me 2 nights before he died, 'If I do not recover it, others will suffer.' I pressed him, but he said nothing more." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Taken from him. He was not kept as Mowat had believed. This changes the landscape completely. Thank you, madame. You have given me more than you realize. As we returned to the damp air, Holmes's stride quickened. We now see the truth, Watson. The letter had already vanished before Welland's death. He was killed not to keep it, but to prevent him from reporting the theft. Chaffin's threats, Mowat's dread, and Dacre's cooperation were simply eddies in a current that they did not control. Someone else, cleverer and more silent, still has the letter. And who, Holmes? I inquired. He gave me a sideways glance. Do you not perceive? The one man we have always trusted, the man who brought us into the affair, guided our steps and was the only person who had constant access to Welland's papers prior to his death. Basil Fortescue is the secretary. The name struck me as a blow. Fortescue? But he seemed the picture of duty and anxiety. It was he who summoned you. Exactly. The surest disguise is to present oneself as helper. Fortescue admitted he destroyed the warning note, but kept a fragment. Why keep a fragment unless to control the evidence? He produced the scorched envelope at the start, as if by chance, but he had opportunity to place it. He was first to see Welland's body, first to speak of the smoke letters. Who but he could manage the scene so carefully before summoning Lestrade? He plays the quiet steward, but he directs the entire stage. I was too astonished to reply, but Holmes's reasoning rolled on like an iron engine. We must move quickly. Fortescue holds the letter, and with it a weapon against the bank and perhaps against the government itself. If he suspects our suspicion, he may flee or destroy it. Tonight, Watson, we set a snare. We shall invite him to Baker Street on a pretext of aiding our report. While he believes himself secure, I will press him where his mask is weakest. And when the moment comes, the letter will emerge from its hiding place. That night, as the lamps burned low and the street outside grew quiet, Holmes prepared the sitting room with meticulous care. Papers were strewn across the table, as though in disarray. A decanter of brandy stood half empty by the fire. I saw the familiar gleam in his eye, the thrill of the hunter closing on his quarry. Watson, he said softly, you will observe closely but speak little. Fortescue will betray himself by a gesture, a word, a glance. The letter is our quarry, and before this night ends it shall be in my hand. I felt a weight in the air as if the very walls held their breath. Somewhere beyond the fog-draped windows, footsteps approached. The knock came, measured, polite, inevitable. Holmes straightened, every line of him tense with anticipation. Now, he whispered, let the smoke at last clear. Holmes himself opened the door, his expression one of courteous gravity, and Basil Fortescue stepped into the lamplight. The secretary looked pale, his eyes shadowed by fatigue, yet his manner retained its professional polish. He removed his gloves carefully, laid them upon the side table, and bowed to us both. You requested my presence, Mr. Holmes. If there is aught I may supply for your report, you shall have it. Holmes indicated the armchair opposite the fire, his tone genial but edged with purpose. Pray be seated, sir. There are matters yet obscure, and your knowledge of the club's inner working may dispel them. A brandy, perhaps? You look in want of one. Fortescue accepted with a slight smile, but his fingers trembled as he lifted the glass. He sipped and sat upright, composed once more. The Yard is satisfied with Colonel Mowat's arrest. I suppose, however, that you are not. Holmes's eyes sparkled with a sense of delight. Your assumptions are valid. The Colonel's guilt is genuine but incomplete. He did place poison, but it was under the supervision of another mind. That guiding hand is still at large. Fortescue furrowed his brow, but his voice remained steady. Then I hope you'll disclose the unknown evil. The committee, I assure you, would like to see the situation resolved without more controversy. Holmes leaned back, pipe between his fingers, and let the silence stretch until the room itself appeared strained. Then he talked quietly and deliberately. The unseen villain, Mr. Fortescue, is none other than yourself. The secretary's eyes widened briefly. He laid the glass down without haste. Mr. Holmes, this is a daring charge. On what foundation? Holmes tapped some ash into the tray. On many. You were the first on the scene, and so devised the arrangement before the porter admitted Lestrade. You produced the charred envelope with questionable intent. You confirmed shredding the warning note, but kept a fragment as if to control the evidence. Your hair, sir, held ash of Turkish tobacco, yet you profess not to smoke. Above all, you had exclusive access to Welland's papers in the club. If the letter vanished, it went through your hands. The man's mask held for a heartbeat longer before cracking. A faint color grew across his cheeks and his lips formed a thin line. "You're relentless, Mr. Holmes. But even if I have this letter, what proof do you have that I took it?" "Motive, possibly, but no evidence." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Motivation alone would not be sufficient. But the writing betrays you. The threats against Welland, the notes you claimed were warnings, exhibit the same oddity of hand as the club records you maintain. I took the liberty of reviewing the ledger this afternoon. The downstroke of your G and the twisted bend of your T are identical. You can hide a lot of things, Mr. Fortescue, but not the unconscious habits of a pen." Fortescue's serenity wavered, his breathing quickened. "If what you say is true," he said quietly, "then the matter is beyond retrieval. The letter can't be generated." Holmes's tone was abruptly sharp as a whip. "On the contrary, it will be. You did not burn it because its strength rests in its very presence, not in its destruction. You hid it someplace, somewhere you thought was safe. Bring it out now, or I'll fetch Lestrade and have the Yard uncover it with far less courtesy." The only sound that disturbed the silence was the crackle of the fire. Fortescue's hands clenched and unclenched on his knees. Finally, with a quivering gasp, he rose. "Very good. You leave me with no choice." He reached inside the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a flat packet bound in twine, and placed it on the table. The yarn trembled in his palms. "There," he replied hoarsely. "A letter. Welland got it years ago in India, and kept it hidden. It lists identities, describes transactions, bribes, and thefts of state monies intended for garrisons. Mowat was implicated, but not alone. The letter continues to have an impact on other high-level officials. If it had become public, it would have shaken the government. I could not allow that to happen." Holmes carefully untied the packet and quickly scanned its contents. His eyes shone with chilly brightness. "Remarkable. A document capable of destroying more than one reputation. So you became its custodian, judge, and jailer. You staged threats to scare Welland, then directed Mowat's hand to silence him. Your intent was not only concealment, but also power. With this letter, you could compel obedience, shape decisions, and wield power beyond your position. Is that not true?" Fortescue's silence was sufficient. His chest heaved, and for the first time his polished exterior crumbled. "I sought to protect the nation," he said at last, but the words rang hollow. Holmes placed the letter upon the table with deliberate care. "You sought to protect yourself, sir. Welland resisted you, and for that he lies in his grave. You cannot escape this truth." The secretary's face crumpled, and he sank back into the chair as though the strength had left him. His eyes closed, his lips moving soundlessly. I felt a pang of pity, yet Holmes remained cold, his gaze fixed and unyielding. After a long pause, he rose and rang the bell. "Watson, fetch Lestrade. Our guest has something to deliver into official hands." When Lestrade entered moments later, his surprise was almost comical. Holmes passed him the packet with a bow. "The true prize, Inspector. Guard it well, for it will tempt many to silence it again." Lestrade's expression shifted from disbelief to grudging admiration. "By heaven, Holmes, you never fail to pluck the devil from the shadows. I'll see this lodged where no hand can reach without the law." Fortescue made no resistance as the constables stepped forward. He rose only once, his eyes lingering on Holmes with a strange mixture of awe and bitterness. "You see everything, Mr. Holmes," he murmured, "but there are some truths best left unread. Remember that when the day comes." Then he bowed his head and allowed himself to be led away. When the door had closed and silence returned, Holmes stood by the fire, his features carved in thought. The flames painted his face with restless light. Strange, Watson. One man killed by poison, another ruined by confession, a third unmasked by his own ambition, all for a letter. Words on paper, yet they wielded more power than any blade. Men imagine they command documents, but in truth documents command them. I ventured that justice at least had prevailed. Holmes gave a half-smile, weary and distant. Perhaps, yet I wonder if the greater crime lies not in murder, but in the silence that follows. Fortescue was right in one sense. These words will rattle high places. Whether the nation is better for their revelation remains to be seen. But our part is finished. He sank into his chair, filled his pipe, and drew the smoke slowly, eyes lost in the fire's depths. And though the night beyond Baker Street was thick with fog, I could not shake the image that lingered with me, words writing themselves upon air, refusing to vanish as if truth itself, once loosed, would always find a way to be read. The hours after Fortescue's arrest passed in a strange quiet. Baker Street felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of the revelations. I busied myself with my notes, attempting to order the events into some coherent narrative, yet I found my thoughts unsettled. The faces of Mowat, Chaffin, Dacres, and now Fortescue jostled against one another like fragments of a broken glass, each reflecting a shard of guilt. Holmes sat opposite me, pipe in hand, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind no doubt retracing every step. At length he spoke, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I perceive, Watson, that though we have secured the letter and delivered the guilty, there remains a thread unresolved." I looked up, startled. "Unresolved? But surely the case is complete. Fortescue confessed in all but words, and the evidence is irrefutable." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Confession of possession, yes. Confession of murder, no. Consider, Watson. Fortescue guided events, but his hands never touched the cutter. Mowat poisoned, Chaffin threatened, Dacres concealed, but Fortescue remained behind the veil. His genius lay in manipulation, in setting one man against another. Yet the true fate of the letter before it reached his pocket, this we have not uncovered. He claimed Welland had already lost it. If that is true, then who first stole it? And why does Fortescue's account of its origins feel too rehearsed, too convenient?" I admitted I had not thought so deeply. To me, the matter seemed ended with the secretary's downfall. Holmes rose suddenly, pacing with sharp strides, his fingers steepled before him. "No, Watson. Something in Fortescue's bearing troubles me." He produced the letter with too little resistance, as though prepared for the demand. Men who clutch power rarely yield it so easily. "It suggests to me that what we received is but one piece of the whole. Perhaps even a copy, not the original." The possibility chilled me. A copy? But then the true letter may yet remain hidden in hands we have not glimpsed. If so, Welland's death was but the prelude and the play has not concluded. The question becomes, who stands to gain if the shadow of this letter continues to fall over London? He paused his pacing and fixed me with bright eyes. "We must investigate Welland's circle beyond the club. His correspondence, final week visitors, and the staff who handled his papers. There may be one more name in this guilt ledger, and that name contains the key." The next day we worked tirelessly on the task. Holmes went to the Home Office under a ruse, while I conducted investigations at the club, speaking discreetly with staff and clerks. They told me that in the days leading up to his death, Welland received an unusual visitor, a man described as tall, foreign-looking, and with a scar over his jaw. He had asked for Welland by name, waited with him in the library for half an hour, and then left without signing the register. When pressed, the porter admitted that the man had a mild scent of incense and smoke. I informed Holmes about this when he returned that evening. His expression became sharper with recognition. A disfigured foreigner smelling like incense. "Watson, we're back in Soho's cafes. Such a character is not unfamiliar to me. His name is Arif Bey, and he was once affiliated to the Ottoman consulate, before becoming a mysterious operative in different European intrigues. A man who trades in secrets as others trade in coin. If he came to Welland, the letter had already left English hands. Fortescue may have intercepted it, but not before Arif created his own copy. The thought of such a document in the hands of a foreign agent made me uneasy. "Then London is still in danger, Holmes. What are we to do?" Holmes grinned thinly. "As we always do, Watson. We track the smoke until we locate the fire. Tomorrow night we return to Wardour Street. If Arif Bey continues to frequent those cafes, I will expel him from his den. You, my dear fellow, will keep your revolver close by." The following evening was heavy with mist once more, as if London had collaborated to conceal the deeds committed within its heart. We moved silently through the narrow alleys until the lanterns of the Levantine Café appeared. Inside, the air was thick with scent and smoke, the same haze we'd experienced earlier. Holmes scanned the room with hawk-like eyes. There a tall man sat at a table toward the back, partially obscured by shadow, his scarred jaw catching the lamplight as he turned his head. His long fingers danced with a cigarette, and his eyes rested nowhere but appeared to see everything. Holmes approached with calm assurance, welcoming him in flawless Turkish. The man looked up sharply and smiled thinly. Their discussion was brief, low, and full of words I couldn't understand, but I could sense the tension beneath the surface, the cautious dance of two brains testing each other. Finally, Arif Bey removed a folded paper from his coat, delicately tapped it on the table, and returned it to his pocket. Holmes's expression remained unchanged, but I knew immediately that he had found what he was looking for. He returned to me with a light step and gleaming eyes. "It's just as I suspected. He has a copy. Fortescue provided the resemblance, but this man carries the blade itself. The game has not finished, Watson. It has only expanded. We must find a way to retrieve that paper before it disappears across the channel." I asked whether he had a plan. Holmes responded quietly but decisively. "A plan, yes, but it will take patience, disguise, and the determination to exploit Arif's vanity. Men who trade secrets can't help but show them off, even if it's just to prove their worth. We must give him the stage, and when he displays his treasure, we will take it from him." As we stepped back into the fog, the night appeared to be charged with unseen forces. I felt the thrill of the chase return in me, tempered by the knowledge that the stakes had risen above a single death or a ruined reputation. A foreign spy carried a paper with the power to sway countries somewhere in the haze of London, and beside me walked the only man in England who could wrest it back. Holmes's voice broke through the hush, calm and assured. "We are very close, Watson. The letter hasn't completed writing its story." Holmes remained silent as we returned through the alleys, his long stride swift, his gaze fixed on the mist ahead as if he could already see the shape of the next move. I recognized that expression. It meant his imagination had already created the web in which he wanted to entangle our quarry. Despite his calm demeanor, I sensed tension in him. The letter was no longer just an English scandal, but a weapon in foreign hands, and the prospect of its crossing the channel added a sense of urgency that weighed heavily on us both. At Baker Street, he paced the sitting room with agitation, his fingers drumming on the mantelpiece. "Arif Bey will not hand over the paper willingly. He lives by such weapons, and he does not give up his livelihood for a polite request. To seize it by force would be folly. He would rather destroy it than yield. No, Watson, we must contrive a stage upon which he will be compelled to display it. Once it is in the open, I can strike." I asked him how such a thing might be done. He turned sharply, his eyes bright. "Vanity, Watson. These traffickers in secrets are like conjurers. They cannot resist an audience. Arif Bey wishes to impress men of influence with what he holds, to prove his value and demand his price. We must learn when and where he intends to make such a demonstration. Once revealed, the letter will be ours to intercept." The next day, Holmes donned a disguise so complete that even I, though long accustomed to his transformations, started when he emerged. He had become a shabby Levantine trader, his beard straggling, his clothes reeking faintly of spice and smoke. With this guise, he vanished into Soho's labyrinth, leaving me to wait with growing unease. It was near midnight when he returned, weary but triumphant. "Tomorrow night," he said, throwing himself into his chair, "Arif Bey will attend a gathering in Bloomsbury, a discreet salon of political sympathizers, dilettantes and men who fancy themselves movers of hidden levers. He will show them the letter to establish his authority. We must be there." I confess my heart quickened at the prospect, though I knew the danger it carried. Holmes prepared with meticulous care, arranging with Lestrade for quiet assistance should matters turn violent. He instructed me to carry my revolver, though he hoped it would not be needed. "Our aim is not blood but paper," he said. "Remember that." The following evening we found ourselves in a narrow Bloomsbury townhouse with dimly lit curtained windows. We were admitted to a dimly lit room where a dozen men lounged on divans, the air heavy with smoke and the murmur of speculation. Holmes was disguised as a foreign trader, and I was his taciturn companion. Arif Bey sat in the center, his scar catching the lamplight, his demeanor confident. Holmes proceeded with finesse, placing us among the listeners, his gaze never leaving the disfigured man. Arif spoke about countries and secrets traded like coins, his voice slick and dominating. With a flourish, he produced a folded bundle from his coat. A quiet descended. He lay it on the table and rested his hand on it, as if it were a sword. "Here," he remarked, "is evidence of corruption in the highest offices of England. With this one may depose ministers, destabilize allies, and change the game in Europe. Who would bid for such power?" A murmur sounded around the room. Men leaned forward, their eyes bright with avarice or dread. Holmes's hand stroked my sleeve, signaling that the moment had arrived. He rose with the air of a cautious bidder, and spoke in the man's native tongue. The exchange was too quick for me to keep up with, but I could see Arif's smile widen and his vanity grow. He opened the packet and put the contents on the table for everyone to see. That was the moment Holmes struck. He leaned forward with a smooth sweep, his hand gliding over the papers as if to scrutinize them, and then palmed the important sheet, the one displaying Welland's name, the one with the true sting. He slid it under his sleeve and resumed the ruse, speaking smoothly as if still haggling. Arif, engrossed on his own performance, paid no attention. Only after the gathering ended and we disappeared into the night did Holmes speed his pace, pressing the hidden sheet. "We have it, Watson," he said softly, his voice taut with triumph. "The original. Fortescue's duplicate was but a shadow. This is the blade itself." We dashed for Baker Street, the fog swirling about us like a veil. Once we were safe in our rooms, Holmes spread the letter across the table. It was as incriminating as he had predicted. Detailed reports of embezzled monies, the names of collaborating officers, and signatures sufficient to tarnish high-level reputations. I read with increasing astonishment, unable to believe that such treachery could have been committed under the banner of empire. Holmes looked at it with cold satisfaction. "Now finally the chain is complete. Welland died because he would not be silent. Fortescue wanted to control, Mowat to hide, Chaffin to threaten, and Dacres to survive. However, Arif Bey sought to profit, and we were able to reclaim the paper thanks to his vanity. Tomorrow it will be sent to the Home Office for review and security." I asked him if the disclosure of such a document would not upset the nation to its core. He gave a weary smile. "It may. However, the tremor of truth is preferable to the stillness of corruption. The law will decide how much can be revealed, but the letter will no longer be used as a weapon by the unscrupulous." The fire remained low as we sat in silence, the letter lying between us like a malignant relic. Holmes eventually spoke again, this time in a softer, more melancholic tone. "Isn't it strange, Watson?" Words were written in smoke, then on paper, hidden, copied, stolen, and displayed. A series of deceptions, but all leading back to the same truth. Men cannot escape their past. They may burn the page, but the ash will remain, and the smoke will write their guilt in the air. I was unable to respond because I was overwhelmed by what we had witnessed: Lord Welland's death, Mowat's ruin, Fortescue's disgrace, and the corruption revealed. Holmes reached for his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and let a low, mournful note fill the room. It hung there, trembling, like the last wisp of smoke dissolving into the night. And so the case of the letter hidden in smoke drew to its end, not with triumph, but with a somber recognition that justice, when won, is seldom free of sorrow. For even as the letter was locked away, I knew the memory of it would haunt us, as smoke haunts the air long after the fire is gone. The next morning dawned clear, the fog burned away by a pale sun, as though London itself wished to wash its hands of the shadows that had lingered over it. Holmes and I walked to Whitehall in silence, the precious letter secured in his inner pocket. At the Home Office we were met with grave faces. The document was received without flourish, sealed at once within the custody of men who understood too well the peril it carried. Holmes spoke little, answered their questions with economy, and declined any offer of official recognition. When we stepped back onto the bustling street, he drew a long breath of the cold air, as though glad to be rid of a burden that was never his to carry. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I reflected aloud on the ruin the letter had wrought. Welland dead, Mowat disgraced, Fortescue undone, Dacres exposed, Chaffin discredited. "It seems, Holmes," I said, "that one sheet of paper destroyed more men than any bullet could." Holmes gave a short nod. "And yet the paper itself was but the mirror, Watson. It showed men what they feared in themselves, and each acted accordingly. Welland would not bend, so he was silenced. Mowat feared exposure, so he turned to violence. Fortescue saw in it a ladder to power and thus fell. Dacres clung to survival, Chaffin to influence. Each was undone not by the letter, but by his own reflection within it." We reached Baker Street, and Holmes, after laying aside his coat, collapsed into his armchair with an air of finality. He stretched his long legs toward the fire and clasped his hands together. His expression, though grave, bore the faint gleam of satisfaction that comes only when a puzzle lies fully assembled before him. "You see, Watson, how each thread led us onward. The smoke upon the panel, the poisoned cutter, the frightened banker, the overbold barrister, the desperate soldier, the too helpful secretary, all of them pointed toward a truth that refused to stay hidden, as smoke refuses to lie still. And in the end, the letter wrote its tale twice, once in fear and once in justice. I asked him if he regretted delivering the letter to men who might, for reasons of state, lock it away and suppress its contents. His answer was calm, almost weary. "Our task is not to decide what truths the world can bear, Watson. It is to uncover them. The rest is in the hands of those whose duty is to govern. I have no doubt they will bury the letter deeper than Fortescue ever dreamed. But the difference is this. It will no longer be a weapon in the hands of those who play at power in smoke-filled rooms. For now that must suffice." The fire crackled softly. Holmes reached for his violin and drew the bow across the strings, the low notes filling the sitting room with a sound both mournful and strangely consoling. I sat with my notebook open but unused, content for once to let the silence stretch. Outside, the city moved on, heedless of the secrets that had nearly unmade it. At last, Holmes lowered the instrument and spoke again, his eyes distant, his voice quiet. "There will always be letters hidden in smoke, Watson. Truths men would rather destroy than confess. Our task is only to read them before the air clears. For once cleared, the world pretends it never breathed them at all." And with that reflection he rose, turned to the window and looked out upon London. His silhouette stood sharp against the light, the great city sprawling beyond, already weaving its next tangle of lies and revelations. I knew then, as I have always known, that Sherlock Holmes would never be idle long. The smoke of one case had lifted, but somewhere another was already beginning to write its message upon the air, waiting only for him to read it.